Where did Jurassic Park come from? Yes, I'm aware Jurassic Park is a 1993 movie directed by Steven Spielberg. And yes, I'm also aware that before that, it was a 1990 novel by Michael Crichton. What I'm asking is, even before the movie, before the book, what had to happen so that Jurassic Park could be written at all? What did Michael Crichton synthesize before writing the hit book Jurassic Park that would then go on to become the hit movie Jurassic Park? A movie that spawned sequels and video games and toys and theme park rides. Jurassic Park at its core is a book about control and how it's perhaps impossible to have complete control of a complex situation and the consequences of that idea. It's mostly about dinosaurs, about the terror of the ancient past, and it's also kind of about the sensitive dependence of certain systems on their initial conditions. My name is Kevin Hainline. I'm a big Jurassic Park fan. The movie came out when I was 10, and I'm sorry, if you are someone younger than me and you don't have a movie like Jurassic Park that came out when you were 10, did you even live? I remember seeing the advertisement for the movie when I was leaving the Cinedome in Santa Ana, California, and my dad saying, "Oh, Kevin, yeah, I've heard that this is like an exciting book about dinosaurs, and they're like making a movie from the book." And then he took me to a Barnes & Noble and bought me the book. And I have never read anything like that. Just this violent book about dinosaurs and math. And then the movie came out later that same year, and I just went back as many times as I was allowed to, again and again, to see this film that terrified and awed me. It taught me that movies are one of our most powerful art forms. So I like Jurassic Park. And my favorite podcast, Blank Check with Griffin and David, is covering Steven Spielberg's early films. And I thought, why not use this as an opportunity to do a deep dive into my favorite movie? Why not make a little video to satisfy any other connoisseurs of context who might be in the audience? If you're watching this and you haven't seen Jurassic Park or read the novel Jurassic Park, what are you doing? Why are you watching this? What could you possibly gain? Michael Crichton published the book Jurassic Park in 1990. At that point, he was already fairly famous, but this book would skyrocket him to unheard of heights. When he was 16, he was published in the New York Times. He graduated with a degree in biological anthropology from Harvard in the mid-60s, lectured at Cambridge, and then enrolled and was accepted to Harvard Medical School, where he started to write novels under the pseudonym John Lange. These novels were thrill-ride paperbacks about playboys, Egyptologists, and doctors. His first novel published under his own name was 1969's The Andromeda Strain, which is the book that created his full author persona. The Andromeda Strain blends a ticking time bomb of a plot with hard medical science about disease and extraterrestrial life, and it was a huge seller, and then eventually a perfectly fine movie directed by Robert Wise. While Crichton would graduate medical school and even study as a postdoc in California, he realized how much more he liked writing than medicine. He published the last John Lange novel in 1972 and switched to writing a series of books that were each turned into a movie. The Terminal Man, The Great Train Robbery, Eaters of the Dead, Congo, and then Sphere, published in 1987. During this time, Crichton also wrote screenplays, directed films, went on a crazy series of mystic vision quests, projected himself to the astral planes, and discovered his psychic abilities. The dude was a complicated guy who dealt with depression, had pretty serious issues with women, and his own insecurities. Over the last few months, I've assembled a big collection of the books and articles that led to Michael Crichton writing Jurassic Park. It's not exhaustive, but it's been really helpful to dig into what was going on in the lead up to the creation of such a monumental and important science fiction novel. From all this reading and research, I've come up with the three fairly broad concepts that underlie Jurassic Park. In this video, I'll discuss some of the history behind the book and what makes the novel and the movie Jurassic Park so propulsive and interesting, why it might not have been able to have been written before the late 80s, and why much of its impact would have been lessened if it were written at any point afterwards. The three big ideas behind Jurassic Park are the dinosaur renaissance, warm blood, and birds, the optimism of genetic engineering and ancient DNA studies in the 1980s, and the rise of the personal computer and chaos theory. I'll discuss each of these themes in an attempt to build a picture of where Michael Crichton's head was at during the period in the 80s when he wrote Jurassic Park. There's actually far too much to cover, so I'll include a full list of my notes and references in the video description below. I'm especially indebted to a number of books and articles, and I'll try to reference them specifically when they come up. To start, at its core, if you ask someone what Jurassic Park was about, they'd probably say something about dinosaurs. And they'd be right. That's a fundamental aspect of the book. But to understand why we care about dinosaurs, we need to cover a little history. Part 1. The point is, you are alive when they start to eat you. The dinosaur renaissance, warm blood, and birds. I don't know if many people are really aware of this interesting fact. Dinosaur fossils have been uncovered by civilizations around the world for millennia. People just didn't know what they were. If you want to talk about when we actually started to understand that fossilized dinosaur bones were left from an ancient lost race of creatures, we have to go back to the early 1800s. At this period, a number of natural philosophers were studying the fossilized bones from these creatures and realizing they were kind of similar to those from iguanas and other lizards. The British scientist Gideon Mantell is the person generally credited for starting the scientific study of dinosaurs with his discovery of what we now call an iguanodon in the 1820s. Although maybe it was Mantell's wife Mary Ann who found the iguanodon teeth? Who knows? Over the next 20 or so years, more of these strange, large, ancient bones were uncovered, which perplexed the many folks who couldn't square them with any currently living species. And in 1842, the very complicated Sir Richard Owen used the word dinosaur, meaning terrible lizard, to describe the size and majesty of these creatures. He was a very important early paleontologist, as he was able to look at a number of different discoveries and start to categorize these creatures together. He would go on to found the London Natural History Museum as a site for hosting ancient creature specimens. He's fascinating, but we don't have time to talk about him. Instead, we flash forward. The mid-1800s saw the rise of paleontology in the West. The discovery of the duck-billed hadrosaur in 1858 by William Parker Folk opened the door to American scientists finding new dinosaur species at a rapid clip across the country. Famously, the rivalry of American paleontologists Edward Drinker Cope and Othniel Charles Marsh, known colloquially as the Bone Wars, led to a flood of new dinosaur species being discovered, at the expense of the destruction of untold numbers of delicate fossils, as the pair often used dynamite. If you want to know more about the Bone Wars, well, Michael Crichton wrote an entire novel about it in 1974 called Dragon Teeth. While it was published in 2017 after he died, it demonstrates that even early on, Crichton was a fan of dinosaurs. Back to our history. By the end of the 1800s, the prevailing view of dinosaurs was set. Dinosaurs were thought to be slow, and many dinosaurs couldn't possibly hold their own body weight, preferring instead to stay in marshes and shallow lakes. Their head sizes implied small brains, and they likely could only feed on soft water plants. Most importantly, though, dinosaurs were thought to be lizards and cold-blooded. Dinosaurs, for most of their history, were thought of as a type of ancient lizard. The paleontologist Robert Bacher, who we'll come back to, writes, "The very word reptile has a performative etymology. Derived from the Latin adjective reptilis, creeping, the term originally was applied indiscriminately to anything low down and loathsome: scorpions, centipedes, snakes, and lizards." Because of the shapes of dinosaur bones, early paleontologists just lumped dinosaurs in with these creeping lizards. One of Crichton's early and obvious inspirations for Jurassic Park was the 1912 novel The Lost World by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, who is maybe more famous for his Sherlock Holmes stories. The Lost World is a different type of story than Sherlock Holmes. It's a rollicking adventure that was very obviously inspired by things like Jules Verne's Journey to the Center of the Earth. It tells the story of a group of explorers who travel to an untouched South American plateau where there still exists living dinosaurs that survived whatever cataclysm had caused their forebears' extinction. There are a number of moments that tie The Lost World to what eventually would become Jurassic Park, but for the purposes of this video, I want to touch on an important point. The Lost World doesn't really feature dinosaurs as the primary antagonists. There's some scary scenes where the protagonist is being stalked by a carnivorous dinosaur, but the book is mostly concerned with a race of terrifying ape men that haunt the back half of the novel. I found this description in a modern introduction to the novel. Because he was recreating the view of scientists in the early 20th century, his dinosaurs, Arthur Conan Doyle's, are lumbering, dim-witted beasts. They are not suitable antagonists. This may be why Conan Doyle focuses so much on pterodactyls. They are at least fast-moving. But pterodactyls do not permit a great variety of aggressive behavior. They can swoop down and slice, but little else. Like the other dinosaurs, they cannot serve as worthy opponents, so Conan Doyle makes them objects of horror. I wonder who wrote this? Michael Crichton wrote this! Heard of him? Let me repeat that. Michael Crichton said that dinosaurs in the Lost World were objects of horror, but not suitable antagonists. And you can see this depiction in tons of media since. While dinosaurs have been a part of films throughout the 1900s, generally they were depicted in a similar fashion each and every time. A little slow, a little cumbersome, and yes, a little terrifying, but often by virtue of their size and not really their speed. Sometimes green screen lizards were swapped in for dinosaurs, and the little humans would scramble around terrified. Dinosaurs were big, but they weren't necessarily intelligent or vicious. They weren't the nightmare that Crichton would need for Jurassic Park. Importantly, however, was the fact that despite how they were thought to exist scientifically, dinosaurs were still exciting to people. They were constantly being shown in films and in novels. Dinosaurs occupy a unique space in our collective imaginations. Wait, for hundreds of millions of years there existed enormous lizards with sharp teeth and then they all suddenly died out? It's a wild premise. Bob Bacher again said, if we measured success by longevity, then dinosaurs must rank as the #1 success story in the history of land life. But dinosaur science was about to take an exciting turn. Starting in the late 60s, paleontology experienced a few decades of research that would completely upend our idea of dinosaurs. This period, often called the dinosaur renaissance, was largely driven by an idea. What if dinosaurs weren't passive, cold-blooded, creeping reptiles, but rather warm-blooded and active? What if they were fast-moving predator dinosaurs? What if dinosaurs are more similar to fast-moving modern birds than slow, lumbering crocodiles? One of the most important discoveries that allowed Jurassic Park to happen at all was the 1969 discovery by paleontologist John Ostrom of the Cretaceous dinosaur Deinonychus, a 10 to 11 foot long, bird-like predator with enlarged sharp toe claws made for tearing long holes in its prey. This dinosaur couldn't have been cold-blooded. It was built like a sports car, not like a minivan. Even the name Deinonychus means terrible claw. And this was startling to paleontologists of that era. Wait, if Deinonychus existed, what else could have existed? And what did that mean about our assumptions about dinosaurs? Perhaps the key reference on Michael Crichton's Jurassic Park bookshelf was Robert Bacher's seminal 1986 book, The Dinosaur Heresies, which laid out the argument for warm-blooded dinosaurs that evolved into birds. Bacher wrote this book based on his and other paleontologists' research, expanding on a Scientific American article he had written that was published in April of 1975. I've referenced Bacher a couple times now, and your ears may have perked up. Where have I heard about Bob Bacher? Well, in the film Jurassic Park, young Tim Murphy talks to our paleontologist hero, Alan Grant.
And then my teacher told me about this other book by a guy named Bacher, and he...
I think this is kind of a little joke, as Bob Bacher was one of the science advisors for the film. Tim remembers this book as being firmly anti the idea that dinosaurs evolved into birds.
This other book by a guy named Bacher, and he says the dinosaurs died of a bunch of diseases. He definitely didn't say they turned into birds.
But this book is actually a manifesto about dinosaurs being vastly different from the prevailing viewpoint. It's a book that traces the history of this exciting and crucial idea of warm-blooded dinosaurs. Bacher ties his own important work to that of other paleontologists, Enlow, Brown, Heilman. He didn't come up with the idea of warm-blooded dinosaurs, but he did make it very, very popular with this book. The Dinosaur Heresies is well worth a read, as it systematically lays out its arguments in a lively manner. Bacher is a world-class science communicator, charismatic, excited, and his confidence is infectious. In the film Jurassic Park, Ellie Sadler, paleobotanist, mentions that Grant's book is fully illustrated.
His book was a lot fatter than yours. It was like this.
Yours was fully illustrated.
But it turns out the Dinosaur Heresies is excitingly fully illustrated by the author and features some standout pieces. Most notably, Bacher has 2 illustrations of Deinonychus, and in both cases, I can imagine Michael Crichton's eyes widening with possibilities, seeing these creatures. They're jumping, attacking, fast, terrifying. This is exactly the antagonist you would need for a novel. Reading The Dinosaur Heresies in 2025, the book has so many connections to Jurassic Park. Bakker writes about how the dinosaurs like Brontosaurus and Hadrosaurus traveled in herds. There's a description of the Australian frilled lizards with the erect collar, as would be seen on Dilophosaurs in Jurassic Park. Later, Bakker shows his drawing of a Dilophosaur with its two thin, bony crests running down their snout, although he claims in the book that this is a sexual advertising device. A long section is devoted to the idea of what dinosaurs ate, and also their potential use of gastroliths, or gizzard stones, which Crichton uses as a solution to the mystery of a Stegosaurus in the book. Bakker talks about how dinosaurs, like Brontosaurus, may have balanced like a tripod to eat leaves high on trees. Bakker talks about how fast Tyrannosaurus rex was, saying it moved at speeds above 40 miles per hour for sure. Paleontologist Alan Grant's discussion in the movie of dinosaurs and birds is pulled almost entirely from the book. Bakker writes that only in some dinosaurs had the pubic bone been turned backwards, exactly as in birds. The dinosaurs' vertebral hollows are so similar to birds that there can be little doubt an avian-style system of air sacs was at work in these Mesozoic animals. He also writes, when dead bodies lie on dry land for a while, the air and sun desiccate the muscles and back ligaments, contorting the entire body so the neck and tail are twisted up above the level of the back. You know,
postmortem contraction of the posterior neck ligaments.
And before I go on, it's here that we need to talk about Deinonychus. In the book Jurassic Park and the movie, we see a group of dinosaurs that Crichton refers to as velociraptors. But, as is fairly commonly known now, velociraptors, as they are known scientifically, were the size of turkeys. And Crichton knew this. And Spielberg would know this. Crichton worked with John Ostrom, the discoverer of Deinonychus, when writing Jurassic Park. Here's a quote from Ostrom. Crichton, in an apologetic way, explained that in the novel he decided to use the name Velociraptor that I had said was the closest relative to the animal I had found. It's more dramatic. I recognize that most people don't understand Greek. So Crichton knew, but he didn't care. It's also likely that Crichton saw this book, Predatory Dinosaurs of the World, by paleontological researcher and author Gregory S. Paul. Published in 1988, it labels Deinonychus as a species of velociraptor. This is kind of crazy. I guess Deinonychus is part of the subfamily Velociraptorini, but it's not a velociraptor. I guess Velociraptor is just a much cooler name. The second important aspect of Deinonychus that we should maybe talk about is the fact that if we go back to Bakker's drawings of Deinonychus, notice here that they're drawn with feathers. Yes, while most people think that the idea of dinosaurs probably had feathers is relatively new, it was considered likely at the time of the writing of Jurassic Park. And both Crichton and then Spielberg decided that feathers weren't scary. Maybe they'd make the dinosaurs look like 6-foot turkeys. The other book that formed the creation of Alan Grant was this one, Digging Dinosaurs, by one of Bakker's contemporaries, John Horner, although he generally goes by Jack. Crichton has mentioned that Horner is the direct inspiration for his fictional paleontologist in Jurassic Park. This book, which also served as the inspiration for Grant's fictional book that's carried around early in the film version by Tim, discusses how Horner searched for baby dinosaurs in the Badlands of Montana. Horner is most famous for his work on the Maiasaura, a species discovered by Laurie Trexler in 1979. Horner and his colleagues laid out the idea that Maiasaurs tended to their young after birth based on the discovery of nests in Montana. The book Jurassic Park does mention this, sort of. Here's a quote. The reason Grant was astonished was that he had a proprietary feeling about this animal. It was probably a Maiasaur from the late Cretaceous in Montana. With John Horner, Grant had been the first to describe the species. Some real Bob Michaela erasure, Michael. And so, in the 80s, Michael Crichton could draw from a wealth of exciting developments when it came to dinosaurs. Instead of slow and dopey, dinosaurs were now thought to be active and warm-blooded. And more importantly, there existed aggressive, terrifying predator dinosaurs that were a scale that fit well with human characters. But there's one problem. Dinosaurs are extinct. They've been dead for 65 million years. They never interacted with humans. So how do you get dinosaurs and humans together? As luck would have it, the 1980s were also a pretty important time for the exact science you might use to do this. Part 2. Bingo. Dino DNA. The optimism of genetic engineering and ancient DNA studies in the 1980s. Michael Crichton often tells a story about first thinking about the project that would eventually become Jurassic Park.
I remember in the early 80s walking on the beach with Marvin Minsky, who was at the AI lab at MIT, and saying in this very tentative way, I'm thinking about doing a story about a genetically engineered dinosaur, and waiting to see if he would make fun of me. And he said, oh, well, yeah, that could probably be done one day, which I found very encouraging.
The seed of Jurassic Park was a screenplay Crichton started writing in 1983. In this early screenplay, he depicted a graduate student who had secretly genetically engineered a pterodactyl, not a dinosaur. However, he couldn't quite crack it and put the project aside since he did not want the book to appear to ride a current fashion. He didn't want to do a dinosaur project and look too trendy. But you can see that Crichton was already thinking about how genetic engineering could be used to bring dinosaurs back to life. Genetic engineering, if you want a kind of overly simplistic definition, is a broad area of science concerned with reading and manipulating DNA, or the code that determines how cells are built. Humans have done crude genetic engineering for thousands of years. This is a big part of agriculture. You know, crossbreeding, plant domestication, hybridization. But in the early 1950s, as we started to understand what DNA was and how it carried genetic information, many scientists realized that they could potentially manipulate DNA. If you discover the strange language of life, why not see what happens if you move a few letters around or shift a couple sentences here or there? This all kind of exploded in the 70s as we developed new techniques to target specific sites in DNA and blend DNA to create things like genetically modified bacteria or mice or tobacco. And as these sort of things go, some folks saw this and thought, wait a minute, there's money to be made here. So the next decade saw the explosion of genetic engineering firms, which sought to use these techniques to create specific organisms or plants for medical or agricultural use. Instead of waiting for university researchers to explore an idea, why not just hire a bunch of scientists and throw money at them in an environment where they don't have to worry about publishing papers? Then they could come up with all kinds of things that would just make money. This was made possible due to a series of new technologies. Key among them was Sanger sequencing in 1977, the first method of figuring out the order of a given DNA strand. In 1983, Carey Mulls introduced the polymerase chain reaction, or PCR, technique, which allowed for many copies of a DNA segment to be created relatively quickly, so it could be studied. Similarly, 1985 saw the introduction of zinc finger nuclease to target and cut DNA at specific sites, isolating genes in what's kind of like a backwards approach to genetics as opposed to triggering mutations and seeing what happens. While famously Dolly the sheep would be cloned in 1996, Danish biologist Steen Willitsen had successfully cloned a sheep in 1984 at the British Agricultural Research Council's Institute of Animal Physiology in Cambridge. Essentially, the dream of genetic engineering in the 1980s was that we could slice and dice genomes to create whatever we wanted rapidly, and there was big money to be made. The introduction to the book, Jurassic Park, lays this out with a warning as it describes the InGen incident. Money, as represented by John Hammond's company, International Genetics Incorporated, or InGen, is driving genetic research as opposed to scientific exploration. The introduction to the book brings up a real company, Genentech, that created a synthetic human growth hormone, protropin, in 1984. However, protropin was the subject of numerous lawsuits as it was being explored earlier by researchers at nearby UC San Francisco. This idea that there's a tension between research at universities and research for industry is central to Jurassic Park, the novel, as shown in the numerous conversations in the book between John Hammond and the chief genetic engineer of Jurassic Park, Henry Wu. So obviously it made sense to Crichton to capitalize on the excitement and possibilities of genetic engineering for his book. But Jurassic Park is predicated on dinosaurs being cloned, not living animals like sheep, where you can just grab their DNA and muck about. No, we need dinosaur DNA. If you read the book or watched the film Jurassic Park, this idea, where would someone get 100 million year old DNA, is prominent. Luckily for Crichton, there was work in the 70s and 80s toward that end. In 1977, fossil hunter Gerard Case took his buddy Charles Pellegrino to New Jersey to show him an amber bed dating back to the Cretaceous. Amber is fossilized tree sap, and historically has been used as jewelry and in folk medicine. Gerard and Charles, who himself is a scientist and writer and other complicated figure, would dig up a bunch of this amber, including a pair of 95 million year old mummified insects that had been preserved in the amber. As a fun side note, in the last section we talked about Arthur Conan Doyle, who wrote The Lost World. Well, in one of his Sherlock Holmes mysteries written in 1893, Conan Doyle wrote, "I wonder how many real amber mouthpieces there are in London. Some people think a fly in it is a sign." To Charles, the flies seen in the amber were definitely a sign. He, along with entomologist Paul Wygodziński at the American Museum of Natural History in New York, took a close look at these insects and found that the fossilization process had preserved their tissues. And this got Charles thinking about what else might be preserved in amber. Like maybe the lunch of a Cretaceous mosquito, maybe even ancient DNA from dinosaurs. Pellegrino would write about the implications of the discovery in a 1985 Omni magazine article called Dinosaur Capsule. The ideas described in this article didn't initially go anywhere, as they faced stiff criticism due to the fact that organic compounds like amino acids, proteins, and nucleic acids were thought to break down over time. So even if someone managed to get a little mosquito with some ancient blood, the DNA wouldn't be readable. Detractors also told Pellegrino that it would be pretty difficult with existing technology to take any potential fragmentary DNA and do anything with it. In 1980, completely independently, dermatologist and paleontology dork John Cash was himself thinking about how you might look for dinosaur genes. And he hit on the idea of mosquitoes biting dinosaurs and getting encased in amber. He started telling any scientist he could about this idea. And like most random folks with a semi-crazy idea that write and call professors, he just kind of got ping-ponged around. In the spring of 1982, he would suddenly find kindred spirits. It was then that scientists George Poinar and Roberta Hess at UC Berkeley published a journal article, Poinar and Hess 1982, announcing the preservation of cells in a 40-million-year-old insect in Baltic amber. Catch reached out to Poinar and Hess, and the next year they would found the Extinct DNA Study Group. Cash described the group as mature scientists with various extensive educations, travels, and a hardcore molecular biology outlook. And while there was a lot of interesting ideas that would come from this group, it was Catch who was primarily pushing with the idea of extracting dinosaur DNA from blood cells found in the stomachs of blood-sucking insects embedded in amber, which caused the rest of the group a little consternation, since they were worried that this would make them seem crazy. The Extinct DNA Study Group had one prominent visitor who came to chat with them at Berkeley in 1983, Michael Crichton. He met with George Poinar, got a tour, heard about what they were doing, and while he asked about amber, he never revealed he was interested in the dinosaur resurrection side of their work. Quote, he never mentioned anything about a dinosaur novel. In fact, the members of the Extinct DNA Study Group didn't hear anything else about this visit until Jurassic Park was published 7 years later, and they discovered they were cited in the acknowledgments. On that note, Charles Pellegrino was not acknowledged in the original version of the novel Jurassic Park. However, in later editions, he would be. There's a lot of legal drama tied up in Charles Pellegrino, and I don't want to get into it here, but the success of Jurassic Park caused a number of people to want to claim credit. Through all of this, I'm incredibly indebted to Elizabeth Jones, who wrote an amazing book, Ancient DNA, about the history of our looking at DNA from extinct creatures. You should definitely go and read this book. In an article that she would adapt for this book, she writes, in the late 1970s and early 1980s, there were three ideas that inspired the emergence of this novel, Jurassic Park, and controversial area of research. Theoretical preservation of DNA from fossils, the potential extraction of DNA from fossils, and the hypothetical resurrection of extinct organisms from DNA in ancient material. After the release of Jurassic Park the film, the PBS popular science television program Nova devoted an entire episode to the 90s science behind cloning dinosaurs. It's a fascinating episode, but it primarily lays out the case that Crichton was an incredible optimist about every aspect of the process. You see, the research being done on ancient DNA in the 80s and 90s showed that it wasn't really super viable for what Crichton envisioned. As an example, here's Noreen Taras, a scientist at the Smithsonian, showing off that what little DNA that has been extracted at the time is...
Ancient DNA is very beat up. It's chopped into small pieces, and it's chemically different than modern DNA.
Later in the documentary, Stephen O'Brien at the Cancer Institute shows off a machine that makes pieces of DNA, making over 100 nucleotides in a single day. Because of how long a strand of DNA is, you'd need 1 million man-days to fully encode it. This was, at the time of the publication of Jurassic Park, a little outside the realm of possibility. My favorite bit of the documentary is when Michael Crichton himself says,
how you go from DNA to an embryo is extremely unclear at this point. And so my procedure in writing the book was simply to skip that.
And he had good reason to skip it. It's even now not super straightforward to imagine how you would go from a raw DNA sequence to a little dinosaur egg. I hate to do this, but there's a ton of research that's been done since the documentary that indicates that Jurassic Park is maybe never going to be possible. For one, ancient DNA just doesn't have the shelf life necessary to extract it and clone a dinosaur. And even more damning, we don't even know if mosquitoes actually bit and drank the blood of ancient dinosaurs. Oof. But back in the late 80s, Crichton was unaware of all of this. He had the papers to point to in order to demonstrate the excitement of ancient DNA extraction, and he had the dinosaurs he'd wanted to clone for maximum thrills, velociraptors. Crichton came back to his initial screenplay with the grad student setting out to clone a pterosaur. He threw it out, reasoning this would be too complicated and expensive an undertaking, well beyond what could be done by a graduate student. No, if someone were to clone dinosaurs, they'd want to do it on a grand scale and want to show them off. In 1988, he started writing a novel that focused on the creation of a wildlife park of dinosaurs. And while he fumbled with it, he found that he needed something else. See, a good story needs conflict. Crichton needed an antagonist even better than his nightmarish velociraptors. And the most obvious antagonist is humanity, because of how often we find ourselves trapped by humorists. Michael Crichton needed chaos theory. Part 3. I refuse to believe that you are unfamiliar with the concept of attraction, the rise of the personal computer, and chaos theory. As was discussed in the previous section, one of the ways in which genetic engineering thrived in the 70s and 80s was due to an incredible leap in the power of computers and their ability to do very complicated tasks that were previously only fantasy. And a side effect of the increase in the processing capabilities of computers was the fact that personal computers were introduced, moving them from the realm of academia and into the home. Computers allowed scientists and hobbyists to explore how they could run complicated models that, if they were to try to do things by hand, would take years of annoying math. And mathematicians and other scientists, starting in the 1960s, began to study models of non-linear systems using computers. Let's do a quick side note to discuss non-linear and linear systems. Linear systems are those where the output is fairly straightforward to calculate based on the input. More succinctly, the output is dependent on a combination of the inputs. As an example, if you throw a ball, you could combine the speed of your arm, the weight of the ball, etc., and get the output, the motion of the ball, and where it will end up. Nonlinear systems, on the other hand, have more complexity. In our example, the system becomes nonlinear when you start to take into account things like airflow and friction. Friction is dependent on the motion of the object through the medium, which means it's not just dependent on an initial condition, but on a changing condition. A few scientists early on started to notice something after running many of these models. Certain systems were finicky. And by finicky, I mean if you change things ever so slightly right at the outset, the end result was vastly different. This is very different from throwing a ball, where if you get a tiny difference in the amount of oomph at the beginning or a little bit different angle, the ball will end up only in a slightly different place from where it first started. No, it seems like in some cases, a tiny change at the beginning would lead to a completely different outcome down the line. This was famously studied by mathematician and meteorologist Edward Lorenz, who, in the early 1960s, used a fairly simple to us digital computer to simulate weather patterns. He was looking at how the weather might evolve by programming in equations for temperature, wind speed, other variables, and then he let the computer run in discrete time steps and print out the data at each step. At one point, and this is important, he decided that after looking at how a weather system had evolved, he wanted to go back and remodel it using the data from the printout. So he goes back a number of steps, reads what the weather was at the point from the printout, and plugs in those values and starts things up using the same equations. Things started exactly as they had before. But then surprisingly, after a while, things became vastly different from the first go-round, even though the inputs were the same. He was confused. This shouldn't have happened. But as it turned out, the inputs were actually slightly off because the printout didn't have every significant figure as what was being represented in the computer. And this had an effect that grew and grew over time. The study of this effect, this idea about how systems change over time and how seemingly tiny changes produce large and unpredictable differences, is often called chaos theory. This is a study of sensitive dependence on initial conditions, and the classic and very common example is the butterfly effect, where the air pressure kicked up by a butterfly might result in a tiny dynamical change that, months and months or years later, would cause a tsunami on the other side of the world. It's not the butterfly itself causing the tsunami, it's the butterfly's tiny change that has unpredictable effects. Chaos theory is an exploration of non-linear science, although mathematician Stanislaw Ulam famously said calling the study of chaos non-linear science was like calling zoology the study of non-elephant animals. There are a number of books about chaos and mathematicians popularizing the study of chaos, but the three books that I think form the foundation of what Crichton was going for with Jurassic Park were The Dreams of Reason, The Computer and the Rise of the Sciences of Complexity by Heinz R. Pagels, Mathematics and the Unexpected by Ivar Eklund, and most importantly, Chaos, Making a New Science by James Gleick. Crichton lists these three authors in the acknowledgments of Jurassic Park, even saying he patterned Ian Malcolm on Heinz Pagels. The most important of these three books, for what would go both into the novel and the film Jurassic Park, is Gleick's Pulitzer Prize finalist Chaos, published in 1987. It discusses the history of chaos theory, the people involved in uncovering its early secrets, and its application to mathematics, the environment, astronomy, biology, and on and on and on. Chaos is also an immensely readable book, but it's very much a book written about mathematicians and scientists from the 60s through the 80s. Everyone is an important, unappreciated genius, and everyone is a dude. I mean, there's like a few notable omissions in the book, like Dame Mary Cartwright, who herself studied nonlinear van der Pol oscillators and discovered sensitive dependence on initial conditions in the late 30s. But, well, we can chalk it up to being written in the 80s. Gleick, right out of the gate, talks about chaos theory breathlessly. Chaos has become a shorthand name for a fast-growing movement that is reshaping the fabric of the scientific establishment. The folks in this book who study chaos are renegades, often working on this science while the rest of the world thought they were crazy. Gleick writes, as the chaos specialists spread, some departments frowned on these somewhat deviant scholars. Others advertised for more. Some journalists established unwritten rules against submissions on chaos. Other journals came forth to handle chaos exclusively. The chaoticists, or chaologists, such coinages could be heard, turned up with disproportionate frequency on year lists of important fellowships and prizes. On the topic of what to call these scientists, late in the book, physicist Bernardo Huberman is the one who calls himself a chaotician of sorts. The book Jurassic Park doesn't use the word, but it does describe the practitioners of chaos theory, saying they dressed and spoke with what one senior mathematician called a deplorable excess of personality. In fact, they often behave like rock stars. Sound familiar? Reading Chaos, you can really understand how Michael Crichton came up with his idea of chaos theory and its practitioners. Gleick writes about how an unnamed admirer described the mathematician Benoit Mandelbrot by saying, of course, he is a bit of a megalomaniac. He has this incredible ego, but it's beautiful stuff he does, so most people let him get away with it. Chaos theory offers a pretty wonderful scaffolding with which to build a story about the ego and hubris of human scientists, because chaos theory offers a counterpoint to the idea of control. Eklund, in Mathematics and the Unexpected, writes about scientism, which held that the laws of nature were known or would be known, and that the world was deterministic, so that predicting the future from the present was just a matter of computation. Chaos theory, instead, demonstrates that you can't control every variable, that there are nonlinear eddies hiding behind our understanding, and that there exist attractors around which chaotic systems tend to spiral in higher dimensional phase space. Plot out all the properties of a system, and you'll watch as they change in chaotic ways, but with seeming patterns, including the exciting strange attractors. Oh, by the way, I gotta say this. There's a fun part in Chaos where Gleick writes about Joseph Ford, a mathematician at Georgia Tech. Joseph was describing chaos theory using the nonlinear Duffing equation. And Gleick writes that the students he was talking to were skeptical of chaos since the Duffing equation was so fundamental to their work, and that Ford, quote, might as well have told a gathering of paleontologists that dinosaurs had feathers. They knew better. If you want a real solid look into the psyche of Jurassic Park's chaos theorist Ian Malcolm, then Heinz Pagel's book, The Dreams of Reason, The Computer and the Rise of the Sciences of Complexity, is really helpful. Pagels, very early, writes, "I am convinced that the nations and people who master the new sciences of complexity will become the economic, cultural, and political superpowers of the next century." Pagel's book lightly discusses the history of chaos theory, but also expounds on the importance of the computer, philosophy of science, and deep ideas about God and religion. It's quite the manifesto, and I can imagine Crichton reading this and wanting this guy in his book, wanting someone with this confidence at the center of this experiment falling apart. Chaos theory and its rockstar acolytes offers a way for Crichton to inject himself into the book by saying, "This is how it all fails, exactly as I predicted." The various sections of the book, Jurassic Park, are called iterations, with a very specific fractal, the harder highway dragon, slowly being drawn, along with snarky little Malcolm quotes about a system descending into chaos. Oh, I should probably also talk about fractals, I guess. A fractal is a shape that has detail and structure at all scales, often self-similar structure, meaning if you zoom in, it kind of looks similar to what it looked like when you were zoomed out. It's a lot more complicated than that, and there's a ton of fractal content on YouTube, so just go crazy looking at that. But the highway dragon is a fractal that starts with a simple set of rules applied again and again, over and over, until you end up with this very complex shape that, when you zoom in, shows that it kind of looks like itself on smaller and smaller scales. Crichton's book, Jurassic Park, operates in this way, where you can see again and again throughout the novel how the failure of Jurassic Park as a theme park is a failure not of one thing, but many, many smaller things, each of which are their own failures on down, self-similar, like a fractal. Chaos theory is the last piece of the puzzle for the novel. The park and this strange new life they've created can't be modeled linearly. Life finds a way. Part 4, the prehistory of Jurassic Park. So here we have it. Jurassic Park is a novel born out of new ways of thinking about dinosaurs, new ways of thinking about genetics, and new ways of thinking about math. It's a novel where ideas of the past are confronted with the speed and scope of the present. The book's protagonists are drawn from real people, and while it sounds scientific, it glosses over much of the real-world complexity that would be necessary to create a dinosaur from ancient DNA in favor of adventure and terror. Crichton's early drafts of what would become Jurassic Park were told from the perspective of children, given how excited children are at the prospect of dinosaurs and how vulnerable they are to their claws and their teeth. He had a group of friends who provided input on early drafts of his novels, and they uniformly hated the book. He changed it up to focus on the adults, to ground it in more science and reality, and this was what got the approval of his friends. The novel Jurassic Park is a product of its time. Written any earlier, and the math, the science, the computers, and the technology wouldn't have been mature enough to explore the topic. Any later, we have a better grasp on the complexity of the undertaking. We know more about how fragile ancient DNA is, the spectacle of recreating dinosaurs would be a little less exciting, and the genetic technology would be much less exciting. No, Jurassic Park is the perfect distillation of what was cool in the late 80s. Human technology, human ingenuity, our dreams of playing God, and the idea of bringing back terrible beasts from the distant past, and importantly, getting our comeuppance, just as chaos theory predicts. Thanks for watching. I'm making a few more videos about Jurassic Park over the week, so be sure to check those out. And check out the Blank Check podcast if you're interested in movies and directors. And, most importantly, be careful when you clone any extinct creatures for your island-based theme park, okay? Thanks.